Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Jackson Crawford. On my Patreon supported YouTube channel about Norse language, myth, and runes, I've often been at pains to point out the difference between our legitimate medieval written sources for Norse myth and the way they're presented today. One of my biggest issues with the way that Norse myth is often presented in popular books and websites at the present is the way that exaggerated roles are manufactured in the mythology for gods who actually don't have big roles in the mythology as preserved. A key example is the god Ullr, often called the god of winter and snowshoes. Well, god of doesn't mean a whole lot in a mythology where the gods don't have so much supernatural powers as they have exaggerated personalities. Thor is so often called the god of thunder, even though he barely does anything associated with thunder. His name means thunder, but mostly Thor is a personality. And Ullr isn't even that. The idea that he's associated with winter and snowshoes and archery comes from an almost throwaway description in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda. He's barely mentioned in the Poetic Edda, except as someone who will give favor to someone according to Odin at the end of Grimnismal, as someone who has a hall somewhere called Udalir according to Grimnismal, and as someone that, an oath is sworn on his ring in the poem Atlakvida. Now, what I'm wondering is, instead of there being some kind of lost, big mythic role for a god like Ullr, who's barely mentioned in the mythology, but clearly was important because so many places are named for him, and because an oath might be sworn on his ring, what I've wondered is if you have a difference between at least some gods who are very mythically prominent, right? Prominent in the narratives, the stories of the Eddas, the Aesir gods like Odin and Thor, and then gods who don't have many narrative myths about them, but are rather mostly procedural or ritual gods. I suspect, if that's right, then that category of procedural gods includes Ullr and the gods we know as the Vanir. Let me talk about this a little bit more in this video today. So the difference between the Aesir gods and the Vanir gods is another thing that gets exaggerated in modern books and websites. It's not that there doesn't seem to be a difference in the Old Norse sources. I'm not completely all the way to Rudy Zemek's position that the Vanir are sort of made up by Snorri because he misunderstands just another poetic word for gods as being a different kind of god. They do seem to be different, but it's notable that the only stories in which the Vanir figure really prominently are the stories of the Vanir gods, Njordr and Freyr, getting married, and in both cases they get married down to a woman from the Jotnar, the god's enemies, suggesting that they can't marry into the Aesir. Now, Freyr's sister Freya is a little bit of a different case. She's more prominent actually than Njordr or Freyr. But taking those two Vanir gods, Njordr and Freyr, for a moment, noticing that they're not particularly prominent in our narratives, other than the stories of them marrying outside the gods, and noting also that in Landnámabók, the Book of the Settlements, we are told that in pagan times, oaths were sworn on a ring in a temple, and sworn naming Njordr, Freyr, and, quote, the Almighty One of the Aesir in Almotki Os as witnesses. I wonder if what we're looking at is a set of gods more prominent in, again, procedural contexts, ritual contexts, than in narrative stories. It's interesting that Ullr, being very obscure in the narrative myths, and Freyr and Njordr being comparatively obscure in the narrative myths, are explicitly named as being gods that oaths are sworn on the rings of. In fact, I wonder if that Almighty One of the Aesir that you swear an oath on might in fact be Ullr. It's never particularly clear whether Ullr is Aesir, Vanir, or what, because he's mentioned so seldom in the poetic sources. But he might make more sense than Odin or Thor. For one thing, actually, might not make a whole lot of sense to swear an oath naming Odin as a witness, since he says in Hofmal himself that he breaks his oath. But is this paralleled in other mythologies? I would defer to an expert on, say, the myths of Greece, someone like Dr. Luke Gordon over at Word Safari, or Indian myths, to refer to Dr. Kaylee Smith from Harvard on questions like that. But I suspect that there is some typological, not rarity of gods that just don't get mentioned that much in stories, but do come up a lot in ritual context. I think that maybe some saints in Catholic tradition also maybe, in a sense, sort of more procedural or ritual saints than narrative saints, and then vice versa. How many stories are told about, say, St. Jude versus how many times is St. Jude evoked versus maybe St. Francis is someone you tell a lot of stories about, but you don't evoke as much. I don't know. Being outside that tradition, I can't comment particularly authoritatively. But I wonder if this is the answer to why Uller isn't mentioned very much and Njordr and Freyr are mentioned in such limited context. They're important to ritual, important to procedure, important in one's daily life as a pre-Christian Norse pagan, but not figures stories were told about so much. And that might mean then that we have less lost these stories than just that there weren't so many in the first place. And so our small sample size still reflects a proportion of stories about the main Aesir gods, especially Odin, Thor, Loki, that would actually be a familiar proportion 1,000 years ago, even if there were more of those stories of all of them back then. Well, just some thoughts. Happy to throw this out there and have it developed by smarter people than I am. For now, from high up in beautiful Colorado, let me wish you all the best.